If you make your way to the McBride Museum on First Avenue in downtown Whitehorse, down in the basement you'll see painted on a large round saw blade the story of Buzzsaw Jimmy. So he is perhaps Yukon's most enduring example of someone who is not afraid to take risks. After falling into his wood-cutting contraption, cobbled together from old tractor parts and a Model T Ford engine, this could cut up to 10 cords of wood an hour, much to the chagrin of Keith Halliday's great-grandfather Tony, I'm sure. After falling into this thing, he lost his right leg. His story is one of classic Yukon lore, starting with his journey from the east that saw his train derail, killing two of his fellow passengers, and a second train he later boarded, narrowly missing a similar fate. During the years of adventurous mishaps that followed, he seemed to take pride in his injury-prone ways, especially when operating his trademark saw machine, which repeatedly chewed off parts of his body. The culminating incident was when he fell yet again into the sawmill, cutting off another leg, happily and famously not his intact left leg, but his replacement right wooden leg, which he picked up and brandished triumphantly at the machine. Now, Buzzsaw Jimmy is probably not your average Yukoner. He does, however, show, I think he nicely illustrates that indifference to injury, which I would call a culture of risk, a culture that I think is prevalent in Yukon. Now, as an emergency physician, I see the downside of risk quite often. The bike jump that ends in a crash, the driver who falls asleep at the wheel, the teen who has a few too many drinks or pops a random pill. As a public health physician, I get to think about what got them into trouble. And as a father with 2 north-growing children, I often wonder what's ahead for them. When it comes to health in Yukon, we think we have it pretty good. Survey data tells us that most of us rate ourselves as happy, that life stresses are generally under control, and we rate our health as very good to excellent. But when it comes to risk behaviors, it's a different story. Heavy drinking rates in Yukon are much above the Canadian norm. 25% of Yukoners smoke daily compared to only 15% of Canadians. Hepatitis C rates, we lead the country in hepatitis C rates, overwhelmingly related to unsafe injection drug use. First use of cannabis starts early in significant numbers of young Yukoners, especially in rural Yukon. Chlamydia infection rates are 2 to 3 times the national rate. But perhaps most remarkable are some of the injury statistics. And I'll spend a little bit more time around here because I think this has a more direct relationship between risk-taking and outcomes. Now, why should we be so prone to risk? Is there something about Yukon, something about the north that encourages a risk-taking behavior? That's what I'd like to explore, because I think if we understand more about a culture of risk in Yukon, we might be able to do a better job at prevention. So what's going on here? This is a graph where we look at injury rates in Yukon. We see this is comparing deaths from injury, and we're comparing Yukon to the rest of the country. The first thing I'd say is don't trust this slide. Northern numbers from the northern jurisdictions are so tiny that even 3 years of combined data is not enough to be entirely reliable. But we can certainly see a trend here that we can repeatedly demonstrate. What I did just to have maybe a more fair playing ground, though, is to pull out northern data from the provinces so that we can compare north to north across the country. Here you see, in general, serious injury rates high across the north, and particularly high again in Yukon. This is not always the case. If we look at another example a few years earlier, we see that Yukon's not always necessarily head of the pack. There's some variation, obviously, not entirely reliable statistics, but there's definitely a trend here. So what are we seeing? We're seeing persistently high rates of injury in the north, and Yukon is certainly up there with the rest of them. So I think we need to start looking at risk more systematically and consider risk-taking as a modifiable entity. Now, wait a minute, is risk inherently bad? Is risk-taking inherently bad or dangerous? Should we always think of it as a negative thing? And I think no. I think risk-taking is actually a survival tactic. It's an evolutionary step that has allowed man to remain nimble and innovative. So risk-taking actually gives us an endorphin rush. So it's this momentary high that, if successful, can lead us into new directions. So the same risk culture that might bring us into injury, death, disability, is also what keeps us vibrant, innovative, and artistic. In Yukon, we pride ourselves on a vibrant artistic community, on a business community that is innovative, on an increasingly inventive science and technology sector. So how do we preserve this kind of feeling of success with the successful part, but try to improve the not so successful part? So we are a risk-taking population. It's getting us into more trouble than it should. And we should also remember that a risk taken in a cold climate or a wilderness setting is something of a double risk. There is much less forgiveness for a risk gone badly if we're in our kind of setting compared to a warmer or more urban climate. So I think if we're going to try to get to a better place, an active Yukon without the unnecessary risk-taking, we need to understand a bit better what's going on behind the scenes of risk. So here are a few ideas. What I've tried to do here is build a model of risk based on a cliff, we might say, of risk, and understand what are the determinants that make up this cliff. Now, if we're living on this cliff, most of us will be and should be living somewhat back from the edge. We might be grazing, settling down, farming, mining, as is the Yukon way, but occasionally we want to come to the edge and look, well, what's out there, what's across, and hopefully keep a safe path in doing so. So some of these risk factors are going to be, I think, core, universal, and then we can get to some of the more northern or Yukon-specific risk factors. So I think to consider some of these baseline inputs. One of the things, if we start at the bottom there, we have youth, and of course things start a lot earlier than youth. But to focus on the youth, I think, is very interesting. The teenage brain is a time of intense brain growth and development, as we've learned in the past 10 or 20 years of research, where pathways and synapses are being laid down as the prefrontal cortex is being developed. So this is the time of explosive, in a good way, explosive brain growth for the teenager. Here, the teenager is actually taking advantage of these endorphin-producing risks that will lead to experiences, and it's these experiences that are cementing these pathways. So the rational being that emerges at the other side of adolescence has this fully developed planning prefrontal cortex. This is also a time, risk is therefore an addictive behavior nourished in the same part of the brain that nourishes other addictions: tobacco, alcohol, gambling, sex, sugar, you name it. These are all in the same part of the brain. So you can see where there's this vulnerability. Depending on the pathway chosen or the pathway that's encouraged or supported, it could go either way. Being male, you could say, is another way that we think of risk behaviors. If we look at crashes, car crashes, biking, extreme sports, it tends to be more often the domain of the male. But I think the more important principle is that there are gender differences in how risk is perceived and how risks are taken. Vulnerability to addictions, for example, can vary a lot in male or female. So we have to think importantly of gender differences and how we understand risk behaviors. Speaking of males and teens, so I'm reminded of a case I saw a few years ago in emergency. You might call it a mini Buzzsaw experience. I saw this young teen who had crawled out of a car crash. Springtime, nearly graduation, over-imbibed teenagers in the car, including the driver, gone into the ditch. He crawled out happily with only a few cuts that, as I was attending to, he then let out the punchline, and that is that he'd already been in another vehicle that evening. Almost the same thing happened. Over-imbibed teenagers gone into a ditch, crashed. No one was seriously hurt. He pulled himself out, hitched a ride, which got him into the second car. He had a party to get to. So this was important for him. So, and I was trying to understand just what's going on here? Like, what were you thinking? So it is kind of reassuring to know that perhaps some pathways were actually being developed there in that experience. Another aspect, which I won't have a lot of time for, but it's a fascinating domain, is boredom and the relationship between boredom and risk-taking. We have to be very cognizant of the potential for institutions such as workplaces and schools, but I think perhaps more importantly, the passive entertainment that we can be subjected to. It can be boring, and risk-taking can be an escape mechanism from the stress of boredom. There's been a lot of interesting work that shows a relationship between high stress levels and boredom. Social networks, of course, are important. Supportive friends, peer structures, supportive families can either divert one away into other areas or keep one rooted in family and in more sensible risk-taking behavior. So there are also unique and important First Nations aspects to risk-taking behavior that I think argue for another layer of consideration. And that's when a culture is threatened, diminished, or lost, as is the case with Yukon and with Canadian First Peoples. And trauma can become, or risk behaviors can become a coping mechanism for dealing with cultural trauma. On the flip side of that, we have traditionally First Nations being very strong in their families and their community support as a protective mechanism. And we've seen both sides of this play out recently with the residential school compensation claims, deadlines that have recently come and gone. So these are some of the baseline influences. And the next, I think, is to look more specifically at the North and what are the Northern influences that play into this mixing vessel we know, or at least I call the risk culture. So when we think North, we think, among other things, short summers and long winters. And these long winters can sometimes draw us indoors and into inactivity as the temperature plunges to minus 30 and beyond. In short, cabin fever. So can cabin fever actually cause us to compensate when the weather warms up, to do something crazy when we have the chance? So these maybe the larger theme is the great seasonal fluctuations that we may see might lead us to take on risk behaviors. So the North may influence risk taking, but is it possible also that risk takers are drawn to the North? And so if we think of those who come for adventure, maybe they don't come to Moyle for gold, but we do see people coming here for particular reasons, for adventure. The outliers end up here. And so there's a particular Northern personality type, I think, that deserves further study. So we all certainly feel a pride in being Northerners, and part of that is reflected in feeling unique, adventurous, and daring, but unfortunately not invulnerable. Yes, Buzzsaw Jimmy did live to the ripe old age of 94, but not without losing a few parts and with some large doses of luck. I'm thinking of a video that I saw just last night called Awesome Land, Finding Awesome Land. I don't know if you've seen it, which I think typifies perhaps another Yukon aspect. It's interesting that I recommend watching this, if not just to see what your young people are up to, but because it's not called Extreme Yukon, it's called Finding Awesome Land, which I think is probably the most remarkable part of that. There's something about that Yukon environment that is allowing these teenagers to get out there. So Yukon is active, and as a northern jurisdiction is probably full of adventurous risk takers. Add to these layers, including the First Nations perspective, and we've scaled our cliff of risk. So I think if we understand these layers of risk, we might be able to find ways to moderate the risk for a culture of risk that I think is in overdrive. So how do we go about this? Well, are we doing enough of the basics? So if we look, for instance, at the beginning, early child development, are we doing enough to get children onto the right path? Parenting support. And what about our youth? As they're laying down these critical brain pathways, are we doing enough? Are the parents involved? We need to keep the parents involved, hopefully from being attached earlier on in life. Boredom, we need to make sure that in our organized functions, in our workplaces, in our schools, that we maximize activity and creativity. Social networks need to be, of course, supported in a positive sense, and we can learn a lot, I think, from the First Nations strengths and the role of tightly adhered communities. Chandler and Lalonde, for instance, have done some great work in BC looking at protective elements against suicide and finding that maintaining key cultural constituents such as control over education, land claims, self-government, all these things are protective, and you can look at suicide rates from one protected communities to those that have done less restoration, and the suicide rates can vary many-fold. So this makes sense that it would spill over into other health outcomes as well. So these are some ideas on how we can influence risk culture broadly and right from the beginning. If we get closer to the risk behaviors themselves, is there more that we can do? Well, I think we need to get a better handle on northern influences on risk-taking. We should be better at measuring risk. So as a kind of a risk surveillance system would benefit from an in-depth analysis of all fatal injuries. There aren't that many. It would be easy to do this. As well, we can look at near misses and non-fatal injuries. There are lots more of them. We can learn. Also, we can learn from what went right, what prevented that from becoming more serious. In Yukon, we have a history of being legislation shy when it comes to protecting our population. But I think we can embrace risk and safety at the same time where there is good evidence. So we know, for instance, we have lots of ATVs and snowmobiles. We take risks with them. We have evidence of serious injuries. We have evidence that certain elements of legislation work. Let's do it. Third, we can influence and change behavior. Even if we don't understand all these elements, we can still find these kernels of behavior change that for instance, as has been done here in the workplaces, get people wearing safety gear as a point of pride, and you'll change attitudes. So whether this cliff works for you or not, I think thinking of risk as a concept with layers and determinants should lead us to a more holistic assessment of risk. We struggle with many health issues here in Yukon. We struggle with addictions, disabilities, unhealthy sexual practices, high rates of tobacco use, and most dramatically, injury rates that dwarf the national average. But we should be reminded, even comforted, that if we know this culture of risk, we can modify a variety of health outcomes. We can change this culture of risk from a negative one to a positive one. We're an awesome land. And as Northerners, we should love adventure and love to take risks, rooted in and modified by a sense of belonging, with a future to look forward to and an attachment to family. Even Buzzsaw Jimmy would have understood that. Thank you.